In the late spring of 878, King Alfred of Wessex led a Saxon army to a confrontation with a great force of Danish invaders at the Battle of Ethandun. It was the conclusion to over a dozen years of warfare against the great heathen host, and at stake was the very existence of a future kingdom called England. This video is brought to you by Crusader Kings III, the latest release in one of my favourite grand strategy franchises, which is releasing on September 1st. Crusader Kings is a medieval era strategy game with RPG elements, placing you as the head of a noble house, able to use diplomacy, intrigue, marriage and warfare to expand and protect your realm across 600 years of history. More about this later on.
The chain of events that led to the great fight for survival at Ethandun began almost a century earlier, when the coasts of Britain began to suffer violent attacks from the sea by Danes and Northmen. Ships would arrive, plunder coastal areas of their wealth, and melt away before an organised response could materialise. In 793, the monastery on the holy island of Lindisfarne in Northumbria was attacked and looted, heralding the start of the Viking Age. These raiders, who would go on to conquer and settle in much of Britain, have become almost universally known as the Vikings. Viking, though, was not a term used in the 9th century to refer to any particular ethnic or national group of people, but instead to an activity. Viking was a Norse word for pirate or raider. Those who were particularly proficient at fighting and raiding would sometimes earn the moniker the Viking as an accolade. It's only accurate to use the term when we're directly talking about Viking activities. For the vast majority of the time, we'll use the term used overwhelmingly by the Anglo-Saxons to describe their assailants: Danes.
The raids probed at an island deeply divided amongst petty kings and lords. Across the south and east of the island, 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms stood: Wessex, Kent, Sussex, East Anglia, Essex, Mercia, and Northumbria. These had been established by the invading Angles, Saxons and Jutes some 300 years previous, displacing the native Britons to the western fringes. Militarily, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were used to pitched battles between neighbouring states, where one side would prevail in a single great trial of strength and exert its will over the other, with dominance secured by marriage and tributary alliance. These feudal states were unprepared to suddenly face groups of fast-moving, aggressive raiders who did not play by the same rules of war that they did. As Saxon armies were made up mostly of levied peasants that were slow to assemble and were regularly required in the fields, the Anglo-Saxon response to Danish incursions was slow. Initially, raiding season would run through the warmer months before Danish ships returned to Scandinavia for the winter. But as the first half of the 9th century passed, the raids got more frequent, were in greater force, and lasted longer. A huge raid of more than 350 longships was fought off by King Athelwulf in 851, after a prolonged campaign inland. King Athelwulf was the ruler of Wessex, the most powerful Saxon kingdom by the mid-9th century. Decades of earlier Mercian domination had been cast aside by his father King Egbert, who had eventually dominated all of the other kingdoms. After Egbert's death, Mercia and Northumbria had regained their autonomy, but Wessex's grip on the southern kingdoms of Kent, Essex and Sussex had been retained. King Athelwulf had 5 sons: Athelstan, Athelbald, Athelbert, Athelred and Alfred. His oldest, Athelstan, had died in 851, so when the king departed on a pilgrimage to Rome with his youngest son Alfred, it was Athelbald who was left in charge of affairs at home. Athelwulf returned the following year, having married a new wife, Judith, the 12-year-old daughter of the King of West Francia. Athelbald, sensing danger to his position from any new heirs that Judith might produce, mounted a coup. Athelwulf was relegated to the sub-kingdoms of Kent and Sussex, while his son held onto the throne of Wessex for himself. After Athelwulf died in 858, King Athelbald appointed his younger brother Athelbert as his sub-king in the southeast, and then, much more controversially, married his stepmother Judith. It was a deeply unpopular move, particularly with the church, but the union did not last long as Athelbald himself then died in 860. This made Athelbert the unified king of all the counties in southern England, but not for long. Incredibly, just 5 years later in 865, Athelbert also died, and the crown passed to Athelwulf's fourth son, Athelred. The new king's only remaining brother, Alfred, was just 16 years old. Athelred came to the throne at a deeply troubling time. A huge Danish fleet was laid up on the Isle of Thanet, extracting tribute from the men of Kent. This was the great heathen host, led by three brothers, Halfdan, Ivar, and Ubba, the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. In 866, the great host headed to Northumbria, having first extorted the King of East Anglia, Edmund, into providing them with horses. The Danes arrived in Northumbria to find a kingdom in the midst of a civil war between King Osbert and a challenger, King Alla. Exploiting the disunity of the Saxons, the host captured the city of Etherwich, modern-day York, in November without much opposition. The two Northumbrian kings eventually joined forces early in 867 to try and drive the Danes away, but an attack on the city failed dismally and both kings were killed in battle. With their opposition vanquished, the host overran most of Northumbria before the year was out. Saxon control only persisted north of the River Tyne, where a subordinate King Egbert ruled for the Danes. With Northumbria shattered, the host moved into Mercia, wintering at Nottingham. The King of Mercia, Burgred, asked Wessex for help, and a combined army arrived in early 868 to face the invaders. No battle was fought though. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the two kings made peace with the host, which can be roughly translated as paid them to go away. This nascent alliance between Mercia and Wessex was quickly strengthened by marriage the following year, with the union of Alfred of Wessex to Aeleswyth, the daughter of a Mercian ealdorman. The peace that the two kings had bought did not last long. After just a year in Northumbria, the host moved into East Anglia unchallenged and set up a base at Thetford. King Edmund brought his army to face the Danes and was soundly defeated, losing his kingdom and his life in the process. East Anglia was quickly overrun, and a second Anglo-Saxon kingdom fell to the Danes. Buoyed by success, the great host now turned its attention to the fertile land of Wessex. During the winter of 870, Reading on the bank of the Thames was occupied. This time though, the West Saxons were in no mood to pay the Danes off, and King Athelred soon arrived to mount an immediate attack on the host's camp. The Saxons were repulsed with heavy losses on both sides, and a protracted campaign in the field began, known as the Year of Nine Engagements. After Reading came a Saxon victory at Ashdown, but a defeat at Basing. Further battles followed, including a fateful one at Meryton. Wessex held the field, but King Athelred was mortally wounded and died shortly afterwards. This meant that at age 22, and with a hostile army deep in his territory, Alfred became King of the West Saxons, a role that he could never have expected to fill as his father's fifth son. The new king was immediately forced to fight again at Wilton. He won a narrow victory and then retreated. Soon after, some grim news reached him. A second large Danish host had landed in England as reinforcements, under the great Sea King Guthrum. Seeing that his armies were tired and would struggle to hold off the reinforced host, Alfred made peace with the Danes and paid them off. He and Wessex needed time. Their campaigns in Wessex done for now, the hosts moved to Torksey on the River Trent, where they remained encamped for more than a year before making their next move. In 873, the Danes moved up the River Trent to Repton in Mercia, where they met and crushed King Burgred's army and quickly ran over all of Mercia. The third Saxon kingdom was crushingly laid low. In the aftermath of Burgred's defeat, a minor ealdorman called Ceolwulf gained the crown of Mercia, perhaps as a client king of the Danes, but the exact nature of his relationship with them isn't entirely clear. He and Alfred minted some coins jointly in the late 870s, which suggests that the Mercian-West Saxon alliance was still going strong. Having established at least military control over Mercia, the host now split in half. One part, under the leadership of Halfdan, had been fighting on the move in Britain and the continent for a decade, and now left to Northumbria to fully pacify it, settle, and rule. By 875, Halfdan had taken his place as the first Danish king of most of Northumbria. Only a small Saxon kingdom north of the River Tees still remained independent. The other half of the host, the so-called summer host that arrived in 871 under Guthrum, moved again against Wessex. In 875, the host launched surprise seaborne attacks on the south coast, managing to elude the West Saxon armies until a storm wrecked more than 100 Danish ships, stranding the host at Exeter and enabling Alfred to impose terms upon them in 876. Guthrum and his men were expelled from Wessex and returned to Mercia, where they spent the next year enforcing a partition in the kingdom. King Ceolwulf maintained control over the west, while the eastern half of Mercia fell under direct Danish rule. With the Danes preoccupied internally, it looked like Wessex was secure for the time being. King Alfred spent Christmas in 877 at the royal estate of Chippenham in Wiltshire. But perhaps taking advantage of the distraction of the festivities, the host launched a stunning surprise midwinter assault, overwhelming the scant defenders of the town in an audacious attempt to literally decapitate the West Saxon state. Alfred barely escaped with his life and was forced to flee, with no ability to raise an army quickly enough to stand against the invaders. Guthrum's Danes quickly overran much of Wessex. Large numbers of the Saxon nobility either fled overseas or paid tribute to the host. Guthrum's forces were further backed up by the landing of a Danish force under Ubba, one of the leaders of the original host on the Devon coast at Kynwit. Ubba was confronted by Odda, the Alderman of Devon. In a short and sharp battle, Ubba was slain along with 800 of his men, ending at least one of the Danish threats that winter. King Alfred's retreat from Chippenham led him to the Somerset marshlands, where the terrain made it difficult for the Danes to occupy in force. With a small retinue, Alfred set up base at Athelney, a small island of solid ground amongst the marshlands. It was an isolated, easily defensible place, but with good connections to parts of Wessex. Access to the Severn estuary could be easily obtained from the River Parrett at Staithe and Langport, allowing for a flow of supplies and information.
A lookout could be maintained here at Burrow Mump, a mile or so away from Athelney, providing good forewarning of any approach by hostile forces. From his base at Athelney, King Alfred began to conduct the same kind of hit-and-run campaign that the Danes had used so effectively for decades. Alongside Saxon raiding parties, messengers were sent far and wide to try and rally support for the king and boost morale amongst the population.
The king needed to find out who would fight with him. He had been abandoned by so many and possibly even betrayed by Wulfhere, the Alderman of Wiltshire, who may have had something to do with the attack on Chippenham that almost killed Alfred. Alfred must have received some encouragement from some replies to his letters, because in the middle of May 878 he left Athelney and headed east for 2 days, to a muster point at Egbert Stone, on the boundary between Somerset, Wiltshire and Dorset. A force from all 3 counties was mustered there, along with some troops from Hampshire, and Alfred set about taking his kingdom back. The day after the muster, the West Saxon army moved across country to Eastleigh Wood, just north of the village of Sudden Venie. From there, having received the last reinforcements and reports of the host's position, Alfred took his army north to a royal estate at Ethandun the following day. There the Danes awaited, and a single great battle was to be fought. The stakes could not have been higher. Defeat for Alfred would have meant nothing less than the destruction of Wessex, just as had happened to Northumbria, Mercia and East Anglia, and the end of the last Saxon kingdom that could hope to mount real resistance to the Danes. The most likely site for the battle is on the modern-day Eddington Hill, a large open space it was ideal for the Saxons to deploy their shield wall. In massed combat like this, the Saxons were an effective force. The Danes, meanwhile, were a force specialised in raiding and in seaborne attacks. When drawn into large-scale land combat, their record was decidedly mixed. As for the course of the battle itself, we know very little. The entire description in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is just a few lines long. Alfred went to Ethandun, and there he fought against the entire host and put it to flight, and pursued it up to the fortification. The fortification in question is likely to have either been Chippenham, which the Danes had held as a base since Christmas, or Bratton Camp, an old Iron Age hill fort a couple of miles west of Ethandun. There's strong evidence for both, and the Chronicle sees no reason to tell us which it was. 14 days after the battle, the host capitulated from inside its fortification, whichever one it was, and Alfred imposed his terms. Hostages were taken, the host was expelled from Wessex, and Guthrum was required to convert to Christianity. A month later, the Danish king and 30 of his most senior retinue were baptised in the River Parrett at Aller, just a couple of miles from Athelney. Guthrum became King Athelstan of East Anglia, with Alfred as his godfather. The new peace between Dane and Saxon was cemented with the treaty marking the border between Guthrum and Alfred's domain, and 12 days of feasting at Wedmore. With this, a measure of peace returned to England for the first time in more than a decade, but it was a peace with more than half of former Saxon land now firmly a part of the Danelaw. And as with previous truces, it was a peace that ultimately would not last long. You can play out your own Danish invasion of Britain in Crusader Kings III, which releases on September 1st. The 867 start date has things perfectly poised for this, with the Great Heathen Host having seized control of York and is poised to push into the rest of Northumbria. You could take the reins of the Danes and try and sweep the Saxons fully from England, or lead the Saxon counterattack as Alfred himself. Click the link in the description below to check out CK3 and pick yourself up a copy ahead of its release. Thanks to Paradox for sponsoring this video.